Chapter 10, Key Issue 3, Content Objective. Explain why developing countries face obstacles to develop. Developing countries must increase their rate of growth. This means increasing per capita GNI more rapidly and using the additional funds to improve social and economic conditions. Keep that in mind as we talk about the difficulties for developing countries to sustain development or to grow development. Your ICANN statement: summarize the two paths to development, explain the 5 stages of Rostow's economic development model, explain the main weaknesses to Rostow's economic model, describe the shortcomings of the 2 development paths and reasons for international trade has triumphed, describe key objectives to technology transfer. Next, explain the main sources of finance development. And lastly, explain problems with financing development in developing and developed countries. Here we have the 2 paths to development. Developing countries face 2 fundamental obstacles. Their obstacles are avoiding policies that successfully promote adopting policies that successfully promote and sustain development, finding funds to pay for the development. The self-sufficiency approach, it balances growth across economic sectors. It encourages domestic production of goods and discourages foreign ownership, businesses, and resources. They protect their businesses. In doing so, protecting from the international businesses, they impose barriers or import limitations, higher taxes, tariffs, fixing quotas. Fixing quotas is the limit of quantity a country can import, or requiring them to have a license. They also insulate, meaning fledgling businesses that are not doing so well. They nurse them back to success by eliminating competition from international businesses. And then also with self-sufficiency, investment is spread equally across all economic sectors, thus providing equal income, where incomes in the countryside can keep pace with those in the city. The international trade approach. Again, the self-sufficiency approach was the commonly used approach up until the mid-20th century. And then international replaced the development approach in the late 19th century. When we talk about international trade approach, it's open to foreign investment in international markets. International trade, again, is popular because it identifies distinct and unique economic characteristics of a country and preferences to another. And when it does that, you're now able to find world trading partners. And then also with the international trade approach, countries can produce manufacturing and distribute high quality because of the competition to drive newer technology, better product, and then also lower costs to countries. And here's again how self-sufficiency isolates. We'll take a look at China with Chairman Mao, who was the communist leader of China, led the Cultural Revolution on creating the People's Republic of China. And in doing that, the Cultural Revolution would improve life by assigning specific skills within self-sufficiency approach. Therefore, it produced enough food for everyone. However, it didn't work, and it was a disaster, and this disaster led to 42 million people perishing from Earth. In order to shrink the gap between developed and developing countries must increase their GNI per capita more rapidly and use additional funds to make more rapid improvements that align with social and economic conditions. So it's going to force China to adopt the international trade approach in the late 1980s. Will this approach work for India? Well, India is going to use the self-sufficiency approach as well. But when we look at development transformation, so Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution failed miserably, creating fear of famine and mass casualties, where the idea was to provide food for everyone, but it didn't work. Then in 1989, they moved from self-sufficiency to international trade approach. In doing so, they sustain economic prosperity. They see social mobility with that, interregional migration from rural to urban. They're the largest manufacturer in the world today, so they have the largest secondary sector workforce in the world. But also, some of the consequences are they've increased their energy consumption and also resulted in one of the largest polluters of carbon emissions in the world. However, they have a very high, a very low IHDI score. So there's great inequality between people living in rural areas and urban areas because there's still the poor subsistence farmers that make up the majority of the population in China currently. Rostov's stages of development, he has 5 stages. Rostov was a pioneer of advocating the international trade approach in the 1950s. His first stage was the traditional stage. That meant a higher percentage of people were engaged in agriculture, and that was the high percentage of the national wealth, and many people were in non-productive activities like military or religion. The preconditions for takeoff stage, it's an elite group of people that initiate innovation of an economic activity, and they start to invest in new technology and infrastructure, such as water supplies and transportation systems. So stage 2 is when he says development begins. Takeoff is stage 3. That's rapid growth and limited number of economic activities. However, they specialize in limited industries such as textiles or food productions, and they take off because they're highly productive and they are now sent out to world markets. 4th stage is drive to maturity. Drive to maturity is now countries that use modern technology that's diffuses to a wide variety of industries, not just a few industries like in takeoff, but workers become more skilled and specialized. So now we're starting to see workers move with high skilled secondary manufacturing. And the last stage of his model was the age of mass consumption. That's a shift from production of heavy industry, such as steel and energy, to now just pushing products. People are consuming products, and those products are the large basket of goods, which are consumer goods we talked about in the last set of notes, where they're purchasing like motor vehicles and cell phones and internet and refrigerators, etc. Mass consumption. Again, here's looking at the stages. Some of the weaknesses, it's oversimplistic. The model is based on successive stages that countries must go through independently until they reach the high mass consumption. It doesn't account for countries that are interdependent in a global economy, such as take Russia, for instance, or China, for instance. They were in a traditional society under the self-sufficiency approach with communist China and led by Mao Zedong in the Cultural Revolution. However, in 1989, they opened up to international trade, and they're already in takeoff, so they skipped that precondition for takeoff. So again, every country does not go in successive order from stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As I mentioned with China, they skip from 1 to 3. All right, and again, here's a list of the things that I just lectured. All right, continue with self-sufficiency and looking at, again, the lack of competition provides little incentive for quality improvement, and there's little motive for becoming more efficient in production. So with that, they have limited technology, they have limited technological growth, they don't have advancement of technology, and then without technology, then you're going to lack infrastructure and communication systems. And then there is also large bureaucracy and self-sufficiency. So when you have the large bureaucracy, it leads to corruption. Usually a large complex bureaucracy administration has rules and processes documented by permits. The system gives way for unmonitored power to the bureaucrats or encourages abuse and corruption by the government. International trade also, some of the struggles for less developed countries, there's uneven resource distribution. Some countries in the world have more resources than others. Commodity prices are not guaranteed to rise faster than the cost of the product in a developing country. And then also there's preference change. So preferences change quick with pop culture. In countries that consume most pop culture, in core countries, what their consumption and their preference is going to change quick. And there's that increased dependence on developed countries. So again, you have to maintain the demand for food, clothing, and necessities, and the changing preference. Market decline. Developed countries have found increased difficulty selling their manufactured goods in the world market that has recently declined for many products. Again, shortcomings of the international trade approach. International trade approach triumphs. So trade increased more rapidly than wealth during the late 20th and 21st centuries. This is the measure of the growing importance of the international trade approach. So there was optimism about the benefits of the international trade development model with three observations. They saw that most other countries succeeded when adopting the international trade approach, especially the countries like Japan and Korea that were part of the four Asian dragons. In the late 20th century, they saw them economically develop, and so they asked why couldn't they do it. With that optimism, there was sales of resources, raw materials. Developing countries contain abundance of many raw materials. However, in some parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa, Europeans, colonial powers extracted many of these resources without paying compensation to the colonies. But in the growing global economy, some of the developing countries are very wealthy in raw materials and resources that can be used with manufacturing output to more developed countries. It's also increased international trade competition. So a country that concentrates in international trade benefits from the exposure to the demands, needs, and preferences of consumers, and it remains competitive. So it will quickly evolve to meet the demands and needs of the preferences of more developed countries. All right, and then you have the World Trade Organization. This now adopting of several countries shifting to the international trade approach. Now you have the World Bank, which incorporates the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, called the IBERD, and the International Development Association, IDA, which is International Development Association. The IBERD deals with public administration and legal institutions to strengthen an institution, banking institution, financial institution, and also to implement transportation and social projects. The IDA is strictly, it provides support to poor countries considering too risky to qualify for IBERD loans. The IDA lends money to riskier countries that would be found in less developed regions like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. We see the shift of India in adopting the international trade approach. We can see that India, under the international trade approach, adopted it in the 1990s. So they dismantled the self-sufficiency. So they eliminated permits, so the factories could sell in India and easier to permit access, moving inside and outside the boundaries of India. Tariffs were reduced or eliminated, so taxes on goods coming into the country or goods going out of the country were eliminated, and monopolies were abolished, so you increased competition amongst companies, which increased efficiency and quality of output. And when we look at this in 2018, India has one of the fastest growing economies in the world. However, with the COVID downturn, it has sustained significant decline, much like many parts of the world. But prior to the COVID outbreak, India, there was increased optimism, and India's GDP per capita was $80 per person in 1980, and 1990 was $300. India's GDP per capita has increased to $1,900 in 2017. So when we're looking at this graph, it shows that India, per person, they're making a little under $2,000 a year, which is tremendous growth from in just a short span of, well, you can take 20 years. All right, take a moment to reflect on what you learned. All right, what do you need to participate in international trade? You need abundance of resources, you need high-skilled manufacturing labor, you need international trade preferences, and then you need abundance of agricultural output, so you need commercial farming. All right, when looking at the world trade, we can see that developing countries have grown in the last 3 decades, as well as developed countries. The international or the world trade approach is seen through the percentage of income that's traded by GDP per capita has increased dramatically up until the recession of 2008, where you see the dip in the lines for each. Then the growth has accelerated beyond the recession of 2010, which we don't see in this line graph. Reasons for development. One is the technological gap, which we already mentioned, with communication and technology, a huge gap between the periphery and the core, or less developed regions, LDCs, and more developed regions. The goal is to have technology transfer, and technology transfer will lessen this gap that's problematic to development of less developed regions. That technological gap can be bridged by the following. There can be microloans. Microloans are also referred to as microfinancing. The microloans are alternative loans to like the International Monetary Loan or the Direct Investment or World Bank loans. These loans are usually by smaller companies, smaller provisions, small businesses. They're usually given to women, so they're microfinances like the Grameen Bank, based in Bangladesh, specialized in making loans to women who make up 3/4 of the borrowers. Women have borrowed to buy cows, perfume, bind books, sell matches, mirrors, and bananas. The Grameen Bank has made several 100,000 loans to women in Bangladesh. Those are microloans or microfinances. NGOs is another non-government organization that can specialize in solar power or in IT growth in India and China, or non-government organizations that help the development within less developed regions. Take a moment to reflect on what was learned. All right, let's talk about more financing. Foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment or foreign companies in the economy or another country is known as foreign direct investments. So the main vehicle is going to be transnational corporations and direct investments, which should have been underlined here or highlighted. When we look at investments, however, the investments do not flow equally, as we see down here. Investments in 2010, only 2/5 went from developed to developing countries. In fact, only 1/3 of foreign direct investments went to developing countries, and 2/3 went to developing countries in 2016. When we look also at 2016, there was an unequal flow to developing countries. Most of the 1/3 that went to developing countries went to China, Singapore, Brazil, Russia, or Mexico. So again, there's unequal distribution of the foreign direct investments. And the main investor with loans is multinational corporations. Again, so we talk about the transnational corporations being the main source of FDIs. When we look at 500 of the largest transnational corporations in 2018, 344 had headquarters in developed countries. Of those largest 500 that had 344 offshored their headquarters in developed countries, 126 of the multinational corporations in the United States, China was the location of 120 of the 156 headquarters in developing countries. So a lot of the foreign direct investment is moving headquarters to China. Most foreign direct investment is in and out of developed countries, North America and Europe. So we can see the movement. By and large, FDIs go to areas of the world that can repay the loans. Because, again, transnational corporations are in the business to making money, and if they can't repay loans, then that puts them in debt. And the rest of the world really isn't the rest of the world. Remember, most of this is going to go to BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, or it's going to go to Singapore, or it's going to go to Mexico. Sorry, right here, destination. All right, foreign direct investment in East Asia and Latin America has grown faster than other developed regions, as I already mentioned. World Bank is another loan. And I talked about the IBIRD loans and the IDA. So the IBIRD is this public administration of legal institutions to strengthen financial institutions, but also they provide loans for infrastructure. So projects, transportation, buildings, roads, parks, multi-unit complexes, infrastructure for living. So that's the IBIRD loan of the World Bank. And then the IDA just provides loans to too risky areas of the world. Here we look at the World Bank loans mostly in Asia and Latin America. And then we can look at debt, where again, the inability to repay the World Bank loans or foreign direct investment loans or IMF loans will result in the stopping of services or projects. Here's a picture of construction crew in Central African Republic repairing a dirt road with funds from the World Bank. Another loan by the United Nations is the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are the two major lenders in developing regions of the world. The IMF is assistance. It helps countries rebuild international reserves. So it stabilizes currency. And in stabilizing currency, it takes a country out of the red. So it eliminates harsh trade restrictions. Okay, again, the IMF and the World Bank fear that granting and canceling or refinancing debts without strings attached will perpetuate bad habits. So what they've done with, again, perpetuating bad habits, but also with countries and their inability to repay back World Bank loans, IDA loans, or IMF loans, they've established structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment programs are an austerity approach. When we talk about stimulus or austerity, stimulus is when you have stimulus that's added by a government during a downturn where money is collected through taxation, and you use that tax money to put people to work to build bridges and other needed infrastructure projects. And then the other approach is austerity approach, and this is when you reduce taxes in an economic downturn. And so spending on government programs would be sharply cut. So government programs such as building roads or bridges or other infrastructure be cut. Well, the structural adjustment programs is an austerity approach by the IMF and World Bank, meaning that they are providing steps or economic goals, objectives to meet the financial requirement. So really what we're seeing is that economic reforms or adjustments, goals and strategies for achievement, they typically they follow spending on what only they can afford, direct benefits to only the poor, not the elite, diverting investment from military spending to health and education, so just shifting money where it's moving within the tax dollars, investing scarce resources where they will have the most impact, encouraging a more productive private sector, so stimulating for-profit businesses, and reforming the government. So again, it's an austerity approach that really provides objectives and goals by diverting tax dollars or minimizing tax dollar usage or reforming how they collect taxes or use taxes. Critics charge that the poverty worsens under the structural adjustment programs. It cuts programs such as health and education or social services. It leads to higher unemployment because they're not increasing jobs on projects like the World Bank IBIRD, the IBIRD loans or the BIRD loans of the World Bank, and the World International Monetary Fund's not putting money into stabilizing the debts of or the currency of a country. And then also they complain, critics state that the loss of jobs in state enterprise and civil services, and then there's less support for the most of the people that are in need of these um, loans in economic assistance programs. Structural adjustment programs are found in, again, mostly less developed countries. Again, structural adjustment programs are when world loans fail, so International Monetary Fund or World Bank loans fail. And again, when they cannot repay, then infrastructure building halts or it stops. And when we look at World Bank itself has judged half of the projects it has failed in Africa. So half of the World Bank loans in Africa have failed or they've been faulty. And several reasons for that, because of faulty engineering, the squander of or spend aid on armaments or military weaponry, or they're stolen in corruption of government or GAF kickbacks to their friends of government, or new infrastructure does not attract other investment. So there's several reasons why these loans will fail. We see with structural adjustment programs, we see globalization has compelled many countries to re-examine their commitment to international trade. So with, again, these loans not working for many less developed countries, medium developed countries and less developed countries, they've looked at possibly going back to self-sufficiency. Other countries are unfair competitors because they pay lower wages and do less to protect their environment. International organizations offer inadequate protection against theft or patents and international property. International trades causes the loss of types of jobs at home. So again, we've seen the debate of international trade, and again, that approach failing some developing regions because of the failure of loans in the World Bank, the IMF, the structural adjustment program loans, and then also the foreign direct investment of transnational corporations. I did talk about microfinance earlier. Again, this would be an alternative loan that is created within a country that is less developed and not depending on international loans from the World Bank or IMF or foreign direct investment of transnational corporations. What are the biggest loan problems? Again, MDCs go to MDCs, economic collapse in Africa, as I already mentioned. Half of the loans in Africa have failed. We can look at what's the best explanation or limitation of the World Bank, world financing, and direct investments. It only goes to certain regions of the world. And most of it goes from developed to developed, or very highly developed to very highly developed. Quickly review what you've learned. We talk about financing in developed countries, and again, a global economy. We've seen that with the housing bubble crisis. That was when hedge funds failed and the housing market crashed. That had a ripple effect that went global. And the harsh effect was on developing countries. This is the stimulus and austerity that I talked about earlier. And again, when countries in the economic downturn, they'll turn to the stimulus, paying money into taking tax money and creating government jobs, as seen in President Bush's reign and also President Obama's reign. Austerity is reducing taxes, so cutting government jobs and increasing private sector for-profit businesses. We see this stimulus austerity play out in Europe with Northern Europe. It's called the North-South split. The southern poorer part of Europe, less developed part of Europe, asked for stimulus through the EU, or the Central European Bank, while northern European countries that are more developed ask for austerity approaches. And again, this is one of the several factors that led to the Brexit in the United Kingdom. But remember, one of the main causes was the movement of people in and out of their borders of the Eurozone freely, especially with immigrants. It shows you the north-south split. Again, economically, development is much higher in the north, poorer in the south.